Okay, we're live, and thanks to everyone for joining in. We'll be hopefully going on no longer than an hour, depending on how much we like to talk about. This is my friend, the Nameless One, or No Name, or just blank, in case you
Yep.
don't know his name. He likes to remain as anonymous as possible, and that's totally cool. And we are talking about a topic which I think I'm still doing a series on. I seem to have many series on the go. I never seem to finish. This is on objective criticism in media or arts, specifically related to storytelling and arguments and questions thereof. This happens pretty much every week.
I can hear you in your. I hear like an echo from your side.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah.
An echo. Is that because you're watching the video as well?
Am I? No. Oh no, it is. Okay, yeah. It's sorry. It's on the Discord. God
Just
damn it! I was
mute.
losing my mind.
Yeah, just mute that. You'll
Sorry.
be good.
Fuck. I'm so sorry. God damn it.
It happened to me. It's okay.
Ah, I'm so sorry.
So we're doing a live stream on this topic. I believe the No Name is going to be making a video himself.
Yep.
And
Eventually.
right, eventually, yeah, these things take time. I mean, whenever our passions get the better of us and we wake up in the middle of the night, we're like, oh, we gotta it's driving
Yeah.
me nuts.
Exactly.
And there's too many people on social media screaming at us about, oh, you're a subjective
Ugh.
liar. You don't understand epistemology. Blah blah blah. It's like, yeah, okay, thanks, great. And then we vent ourselves out and get it all out of our chest, and that's what we do. So the main question that we usually ask, or we are asked, is what is or what can be objectively good? And there's several ways to approach that, but first you have to define what an objective observation is and how you come to an objective conclusion. And the start is it is any observation that has nothing to do with your personal feelings or opinions when you represent the truth or the facts. So that is an objective observation. And then,
I mean, I would say to a degree, yes. But I think that I think there's a false dichotomy there that you have to suppress your subjective views, and because of that, people mistake what it means to be objective instead of subjective.
there was always a
Uh,
certain blend of
yeah,
emotion in everything. That's true. And we
yeah,
don't say suppress it. We just say eliminate
mm,
the personal
mm,
reaction, and then once you understand the observation, then you can start interpreting what it means if you want to talk about your feelings. That's totally fine. Whereas I like to do that later because I want to first observe the truth and then
right.
say, now this is what is there. So the first thing is an observation, which is good. And then we get into what is referred to as representative function or the function of a thing. And that has to have three major elements. So there has to be, we have to know what a car is to know what is a good car or a bad car. We then have to see that object presented well. So if it's a Ferrari, and I have to know what a Ferrari is, meaning it's very fast or it handles really well, we can't see a Ferrari being driven to the corner store. It's not a good representation of a Ferrari. And then we have to actually have that referenced elsewhere, some other example, so we know, okay, we know exactly what a Ferrari is. It's a fast car. It's a very fast sports car. It's red. It's Italian. It's this and that.
Yeah,
So
cognitive context, basically.
we need to get context. That's correct.
Mhm.
And it's based on function. So if we know it's a good Ferrari or a bad Ferrari based on if it is a functional vehicle, it does the thing it's supposed to do, be a sports car and be fast and comfortable and expensive and nice. And if
Right.
it's not, then we say it's objectively bad. It's
Well,
not.
I mean, I would say that first you have to set up the standards. Like, for example, if you set up the proper standards that it doesn't go fast, then it doesn't. I would say that it's in integration of many different standards molded together. Like, it has to be properly fast, it has to properly steer, it has to be safe, etc., etc. And when there is all these qualifiers that are met, then we declare that it is a good car
That's
instead of a
that's
bad
true.
car.
The problem becomes though is some person. Let's say we have two observers, observer A and B, and observer A sees four objective qualities, so he makes four standards from that,
Right.
and the person B sees three object. Maybe he didn't see the fourth one. He sees three, but he comes up with six standards. And then you have to say, okay, well, where are you getting these standards? And that's where the argument comes into play, because neither of them are using subjective interpretation. They're just seeing more than what the other person is seeing. So the observation is the same, except for person B who missed an observation, and the standards and criteria are simply more or less.
Right.
There's not like there cannot be a contradiction of standards
Right.
unless something is been observed that someone has not seen. Or
I
there,
just think that depends on whether or not the standard is arbitrary, which is the qualifier for whether or not a standard becomes a proper standard. It's more standard of standards.
right.
Like if a person just says that if the color is red, that's not really a standard on what makes a car good. It's the overall functionality and integration of all the other functions within the car itself that determines whether or not it's good,
Yeah.
not one single element.
And in relation to storytelling, I always give the example of not a genre, not a subgenre, but a series. So like James Bond. James Bond, he has a femme fatale, he has a fast car, he has a gadget, there's a chase scene, there's a villain. Like, these elements are pretty much consistent throughout the series. So we expect that on the next James Bond. If it doesn't have that, they have to either add something like it. So instead of a femme fatale, then a
I
male.
mean, I mean, I would argue that it doesn't have to adhere to it because it's just demanding that it conforms to a previous standard. It should create its own standards, but um, it has to. If it creates its own standard, it still has to adhere to it, and it has to be of proper quality, rather than just because if it's just like oh James Bond just required gadgets, that doesn't mean that the next James Bond doesn't need to not have a gadget. There just needs to be a proper reason for it, and that it's interrelated with well, the story itself and its element.
Well, I think reasoning is really the key point of analysis. When you talk about critical analysis, you're looking for meaning of any sort. And if you just have gadgets for the sake of it, then yeah, that's going to be a bad or objectively bad standard, or at least an example. Because why does Bond need 5 gadgets if they're just for the sake of having it? So it's kind of contrived as well. When some gadgets aren't really a gadget; they're just a defibrillator or something that's in the car or in the hospital. Of course, it's what you expect. It's not something that he could pull out a pen and all of a sudden it becomes a laser. So
Right.
like you need these things for a certain reason. So let's take an example of two different people again, and let's say that their standards are biased. So, but they're going to use objective observation. So the best example I like of this is that you have someone who hates science fiction, but he watches the same movie or reads the same book as someone else, but he loves that one chapter. And you can say the same of the opposite. So someone who loves science fiction, but he hates that one chapter. Now,
Yeah.
that the example is Game of Thrones. I think the last season, I think everyone can agree with, that was bad. But why was it bad? And that's where we get into the details. And that's why these kinds of people, even though they have exactly the opposite conclusions and appreciations of the genre or the type, they're going to have objective truths because it's someone coming from a perspective of hatred going into a perspective of liking. So this is where they're using objective observation, but they're coming to subjective effects,
Right.
which
But
is
I
still
still
true.
think that I don't disagree. I just think that there's an element of added subjectivity to it. Like they're coming from a perspective of they hate it, they love it. They're putting their own evaluation on it, disregarded from having any standards for on whether or not it's good or not. And that's, I think, the central issue beyond just that they're adhering to facts, because there has to be it's mainly the standards that are applied on how we judge whether something is good or bad, merely beyond just saying that something is an objective fact.
Right. So even though these people have different perspectives, so long as they're using evidence and whatever meaning they find from that evidence, like the pen is a very good gadget in James Bond because it produces a laser which solves the problem, then that could be used as a useful technique for understanding a body of work or that particular scene in a body of work with objective criticism, because you're actually saying this is what happens and this technique or this function of this thing is working soundly and properly, as opposed to just being a clearly biased device or for the sake of having a gadget or whatever other special effect they wanted to use. So
Right.
that is another
Um,
thing.
I would also add to this that we should also separate. I'm going to expand on this later, but we should. It is also important to separate between what is analysis and what is criticism, because I argue that understanding the meaning of a scene is different from applying criticism towards it. And the difference between the two that I argue is the understanding of both. And I argue that analysis is merely interpretation of meaning and values and ideas within a piece of media. In comparison, criticism is more about, um, well, it's still a part of analysis, but it's more evaluating the degree of integration and interrelation between all the elements that create a unified whole.
And that would be based on a standard of the type or the genre, the
Uh,
subgenre, the
that adds to it, but it doesn't have to adhere to it. Like it's the equivalent of saying that a fantasy genre it has to adhere to the elements of fantasy. It can, but it doesn't have to. The only thing that is important is that it follows its own, well, its own verisimilitude, which just means following its own logical rules within its own setting, and that the ideas are or coherent.
well,
I
that's
argue that I argue that these are the two foundations for criticism,
that would be
or
the
effective
assumed
criticism.
foundation that the story itself is already solid. Like obviously we want a solid story regardless of genre, so that the characters are
Yes.
doing their plot, they're doing things logically, they have lore that makes sense and it's not breaking every 2 minutes. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's part of verisimilitude.
Yeah,
Just
so we're
there's added
going
elements to
so
it.
we're taking it as a piece of fiction or piece of media, then we're going so fiction, then we have the media or the medium, so video, audio, gaming, whatever. Then we go into genre, then we go into subgenre, and then we get into the details like the theme, the characterization, the tone, all the details of storytelling that are relevant. And those are all independent. So subgenre
Uh,
exists
I
independently
mean,
of medium.
I disagree. Like, I don't think they're independent. Argue that it's the opposite. Actually, they're all interdependent. Not interdependent. They're all important, and the way that they all mesh together is how we judge whether something is uh, good or bad. It's using a Ferrari for example. It's not merely, oh yes, let's look at the wheel and how the wheel is good, and look at this. It's all the parts, whether they're good, and how they all mesh together to create the unification of the car that we qualify it as good. There could be like some elements that are bad, like I don't know, for example, the wheel is badly shaped or whatever, or in comparison, like there's a bad actor, but it's the unifying of the whole the entire end product and how it comes together that
In
we judge whether something is good or bad.
in that relation, I could take the idea of car or engineering of a car, like the wheel, the shape of the wheel, the handling, as independent of its whole. So I could say that a story has to have a certain plot, has to have a certain
Oh yeah,
characterization for what it's doing.
I
And
don't disagree. I just think that there has, although you can focus on that, you have to emphasize the unification, because no story is just independent. There's no like just story without any, like it's like the equivalent of saying that a film is only the story, and you should not like pay attention to how the music goes with the scenes, and how the characters and their themes go together, and how all these elements are interrelated. Because if you only focus on the separate parts, you don't see the whole as together.
well, I'm not saying denying, I'm just saying evaluate it individually. Because if you say that, oh, this scene is horrible because of the music, then you're choosing a bias over one element over the other.
Right.
And to do that sort of denies what's actually the rest of the media itself, or the rest of the story, or the rest of the scene, or what, the rest of the characterization. So we're not denying that those things exist. We're just trying to be as minimalistic as possible and saying, let's
Mhm.
look at the dialogue. Let's look at the stage the design. Let's look at the camera work, or let's look at whatever. So that's what I'm saying. Obviously, as when you experience it, you experience everything all at once, and your brain is like, "Wow, look at this amazing transformer beating up another transformer. It's crazy." So that's true. But when you go through analysis, you actually break it apart and you try to figure out what's there. So
Yeah.
that's a good segue into our next point, or my next statement is everyone is different. Isn't the purpose of a story relative to the individual?
No.
I would
Oh,
agree. I would agree. I would say the purpose of a story is very specific. When you make a story or when you write a story, you are talking about a certain collection of ideas that some other writer has done some elsewhere, not in the same order, not in the same way, but you're expecting that. So it's the same argument with genre. When I go to read a book, and let's say I never read The Time Traveler's Wife, I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a science fiction novel, and there's going to be a wife and a husband, and it's going to be some sort of weird, I don't know, how do you cope with a time traveler who's your husband sort of thing. And ultimately, that's what it's about. But I
mhm.
was assuming hard science fiction, I was assuming romance. It's a little bit of everything. So, as you say with genre, it's its own idea, it's its own instance of the genre, its own thing, and you should evaluate it for what it's worth as opposed to, well, I think a romance story should go this way.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah,
Like, yeah, I don't disagree. I think that you can build off your expectations, but your expectations themselves should not be a qualifier for whether or not it is good. Again, I argue that it's the interrelation of all the elements coming together, including the story, uh, that becomes the thing that we judge, well, art by. Because, like, if you were expecting, like, I forget, the time traveler's wife, I think that's from Kirk Von or whatever. Um, you might think that it's a story about romance, and if you're disappointed by it because it was something else, that doesn't make it a flaw. It's how the ideas came together, how the characters are, how the story and its themes were all interrelated, that gives you the expectation of whether or not it was good. And
right.
I argued that for something, if you're disappointed by the story, you have to see how it stands by its own, not because of in the past you were by the conventions of previous stories or how it was related to it.
Yeah, so the first thing you do, at least aside from making objective observations, is in analysis or an analysis of such a body of work, you say, what is the purpose of this work? And you need to base that off observation, of course. So you say,
Hmm.
oh, this is not just a romance, it's not just a slice of life, it's not just soft science fiction, it's all of those things. And it's trying to tell a story of this guy who's married and he finds his wife before she's born and she sees her before she dies or before he dies. All these crazy science fiction elements that you've never would have thought of, and that's which is the purpose of science fiction. So it's basically science fiction light, and you discover it's also a period piece because he's jumping here and there. So it is not relative to the individual. It maybe is relative to the writer as an individual because he wrote it at a certain time, and you have to be wary of that. Same way with books from Mark Twain or from Shakespeare or other playwrights over the years. You have to be wary of when they were written and why, but it's still within its own thing, being a thing and serving a certain function. It's not, oh, you know what, the Blair Witch Project, that's a thing teaching you how to camp. That's what the story is about. It's like, no, it's not. That's not the point of that movie. So that's what I like to be aware. Like people, oh, this is clearly this kind of story. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's really not. And here's why. And you show what's going on in the story by showing clips or passages in the book and why it's good or bad. All right, let's
Hmm.
go to our next point. That was an easy one. Okay. If you give the average critic boundaries, then they're not free to judge stories as they want. And to
What does it
that
mean, boundaries?
meaning, so if we say, well, obviously, if we're using a criteria like you would even in subjective criteria like rose tinted glasses, you're filtering information. And to me, that's kind of normal. Like everyone does that anyway. We always filter information. But when we use objective observation, all we're saying is let's just keep our emotions in check and just focus on what's there first.
I
And
mean, hmm. Because in my opinion, the way I categorize a critic is that a critic generally, the job of a critic is to judge excellence, and the manner in which he judges excellence is again that uh, he evaluates the integration or the unity of all the components working together, and that's how they find or a critic judges whether something is unified. And I think that the real problem is that people mistake that unification and add they add on their subjective evaluation of how much they enjoyed something or how much they felt by it, rather than just
Right.
by itself the unification.
You listen
And
to
I'm not
some.
really sure what boundaries means in that case.
Well, you're trying to say that you're limiting a viewpoint because that's essentially what we're doing. When I argue for objective observation, I say, well, I'm actually not using any boundaries. I'm not using any filters. I'm just looking at exactly what's there. But when we evaluate that observation, we say, okay, now we have to then take that thing, like the bombers in The Last Jedi, we say, okay, this is a functional object. What does it do? We then have to put boundaries around that object, saying, okay, why is it this way? How is it built? Where did it come from? Why are they so slow? Why are they so weak? Why do they have all these guns that aren't shooting anything down? Why are they so big? Why, all these questions start coming up for its existence. Why I can or cannot believe in its existence in the story and how it functions. Whereas someone else would, like a girl, would look at The Last Jedi and say, well, you know what? It had those really cute flying penguins. It was an awesome movie, and they were bouncing around, and one almost got eaten. That was really like they'll have this viewpoint that is what was most important because that's what they care about, as opposed to looking at the function of what those flying penguins were really, why they even existed in the first place. And you can't really find too much meaning aside from it being a natural occurrence in nature. There's some sort of animal that somehow a furry, dinky little plush toy can exist on this rock in the middle of the ocean and thrive. Makes no sense, but you don't really care because it's not relevant to the story. It's there to sell toys,
Right.
And what I always say to that is Harlan Ellison's very famous quote, and that is, "You're not entitled to your opinion. You are entitled to your informed opinion." So when we talk about critics, we want to know our critics have a certain repertoire. They have a certain experience. They know what they're talking about. They've read books. They've watched movies. They have an understanding of the medium, the genre, as well as the series that they're talking about. So that's what I look for in a critic. And hopefully they're also objective. They don't have to be, but that's usually the best kind of critic to me.
I don't generally disagree. I just think that that's just an element of prestige that adds more credibility to their level of criticism. But as the old saying, everyone is a critic. To my evaluation, the only thing that qualifies a person as being a critic is just noticing the interrelation of all the elements. So, for example, the thing with the bomber, you're noticing all the elements that are wrong with the scene, how it doesn't work or how it defies logic, and there's no proper integration of what is going on, and it takes you out of the immersion. So if a person, for example, does not see that, or they just don't care, they don't see it as a flaw. But overall, as the entire product itself for that movie, you do see it is a flaw objectively. It doesn't matter if you don't care for the fact that the bombers are extremely slow in a setting where every ship is fast, is an objective flaw. So it's all about the interrelation and the integration of the materials. And I think that if a critic is well read, they could notice it, but sometimes they may not. There's someone who's illiterate might notice it and over a critic who doesn't.
Oh yeah,
So I think the only thing that matters is just recognizing the integration of those elements.
yeah. As I said before, you have the two people. One observes 3, one observes 4. We miss things all the time, and
Yeah.
we get more information out of those simple observations as well. So that's also very important, and that's why we can achieve an objective standard, but it's not set in stone. Like there's no like ironclad rule book for this is the right way to make a story, or rather a certain genre of a story or a certain subgenre or whatever. There are universal rules of writing, like be clear and be concise, but if you can justify breaking those rules to provide meaning in a different format, maybe in a long format, maybe in a short format, great. It's all about finding meaning and making sense of the events that are going on and the integration of all those elements. Okay, let's go to the next one. Without differing opinions, you kill the possibility of any true appreciation. This one I sort of gloss over because I don't like the word true. Anyone who says the term true or real or love, like all these big terms that are very generic, I tend to just throw them away. So I can just pass this one through.
What
But
does that even mean? Without differing opinions.
right, because we've gone from having different biases but still having objective facts.
Yeah.
So you're telling, say, okay, I want my objective observer to have all this experience in poetry to evaluate Keats or whomever. So, but what if he's a moviegoer? Can he still do it? He can still appreciate it because he understands drama, he understands emotion to some degree, but the format's been changed. The medium is different. So, can he still do the job? I wouldn't even bother because think of it this way: if I evaluate a hamburger at McDonald's, I'm not going to evaluate it the same way I go to a steakhouse. It's still
Right, of course.
still hamburger, it's still meat, but it's a totally different experience, totally different way of eating, dining, spending money. Everything's different about it. So even if they're the same element, it's a different format. So don't even bother with say, oh, this guy's more experienced, this guy has more. Yeah, it helps. It helps if you have a, a chef evaluate someone else's meal, but everyone knows what they like, everyone knows what they dislike, provided they have proper evidence to explain themselves. That's what matters.
Right. I think that what the question is actually arguing, and I think you hinted at it, is that it's advocating if you, without people having their own preferences, you kill the possibility of appreciation, which what I think is trying to argue is that if people are not allowed to have their own, or they are allowed to have their own appreciation, you kill or deny um, the understanding of what makes something good. So, for example, Burger King, for example, a person may like, I don't know, I don't even know what they have, Whopper.
Yep.
I don't know, Burger King. Um, they may prefer a Burger King meal compared to a steak. That's a preference, who cares? Who knows? But the manner in which you can appreciate something is the degree in which it is excellent. So, for example, if there's a low quality bread, low quality meal, low quality steak, and whatever, compared to an actual like high class, well cooked steak, you may prefer the Whopper because of, I don't know, personal subjective preference. But that doesn't mean that between the evaluation of the two, the steak is better. It is of a higher quality because it is excellent. It is of degree of excellence due to how the meat was cooked, how the standard of how you judge proper meat, the taste, the juiciness, and the proper quality of it being made.
And when you're saying these things about the elements or you're breaking them down, you're not saying, well, I prefer juiciness to
Exactly.
how it's grilled. It's like, no, we're not saying that. We're saying those are the elements. And those elements, if presented well, will tell us whether something is objectively good or bad, whether or not you even like the flavor, whether you even like the presentation. It's whether everything was done properly. So we can appreciate the aesthetics of something we don't even like a vase or a flower arrangement, by saying, wow, look, I understand how this was cut, how this was grown. I can smell it, I can see it. It's arranged in a certain sense of balance. It's a beautiful still life of flowers, even though I hate flowers.
Exactly. And I think that it's the quality of excellence that determines whether or not you can judge it. Because even if you hate flowers, you can still say that the degree in which it was properly cut and the excellence of skill to make that proper cut, you can appreciate that, even if you hate it. And I think that that evaluation of excellence is what differentiates something from being objective to subjective. Because even if you have a subjective bias, you can overcome it by just adhering to the excellence.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going.
Sweet.
How do you determine things are objectively good? Now, I sort of already went from that in the first question, but this is like, okay, now that we've gone through, we have biases that we have to overcome. We have comparisons between different things that you can't really evaluate the same way. What is the actual method? And It's about understanding, as the Nameless One said, excellence, which you do through experience. You use critical analysis. You have the knowledge of all these things. You have to be sensitive to new things, and pretty much just paying attention to what's in front of your face.
Yeah.
It's not a complicated thing, but the first thing you have to do is just say, okay, I'm not going to put my biases in the way, go back to being objective, and just look at what's there. Because once you start with an objective observation, you can come to an objective conclusion. So let's say we have a hypothesis in science, and I think if I do something to the conditions of a plant, it's going to grow better. And I end up being wrong. Well, my next hypothesis is probably going to be correct, even though I'm doing exactly the same observations. Now the conditions are slightly different. And then we have something that works. And that's where we get into details of how science determines what is the proper elements of a functioning system. And that's what we do in everything. When we go and watch a science fiction story, Babylon 5 and Star Trek, why do we prefer Star Trek over Babylon 5 or vice versa? What are the elements that really we enjoyed, and why were they there or not there in the other one? Very simple things. We're comparing like things. We have experience of this, and it's simple. It's not easy in general because there's lots of details to go through. We have to understand the function of those things, but it just takes time like anything else.
Right. I would just I just disagree with the whole comparing one art with the other. Like comparing Babylon 5 with Star Trek. Although there's science fiction, it's, I would say, improper to judge the two because again they're doing their own separate thing. You know, Babylon 5 is about like different races in the pseudo UN station. I don't know what to call it. And Star Trek is more about like the exploration of space and seeing different aliens and understanding different cultures. So they're doing different things, and I think that because they're doing different things, they have to be evaluated on their own premises rather than being compared. And I think that the way that you judge whether something is good is that you judge by what they're trying to accomplish and whether or not it does it excellent in the manner that again you judge whether it's excellent is if all the elements work together for that purpose.
Right. So
like, yeah.
if you don't like Star Trek or Babylon 5 or Mozart or Bach or whatever, you don't have to, but you still have to respect the fact that these were great pieces of work.
Yes.
Like Mozart was a genius and his work was amazing, even if you absolutely hate it. The same way, I can't think of any modern musicians because I don't know, I don't really care, but I'm sure they're very good at what they do because they're not because they're popular, but because there's actually something there that you could say is universal to music or has been popular for a reason. So it's not just the popularity that makes them good. There's something there that everyone can, once they listen to it, they go, okay, this is where the talent is coming from. This is where this unique sound I've never heard before, this unique lyric, or the way it reacts. Because music is very emotional. It's very reactive. So
Yeah.
we can be a little more, I guess, a little forgiving with popular music as we could not have been with the classics. But that's just the nature of music as it is today. And
Yeah, I prefer to talk about other arts than the music because
Yeah.
music is more emotion based, I would say, to a degree. I mean, you could still judge it by its structure, but like I'm not a music theorist, so I can't really talk about that.
music
Like
theory,
music is the only, yeah, music.
music theory is a lot easier actually to study
Oh, really?
compared to history or compared to other things. I think it's when you do scales, that's pretty much all you're doing is understanding the form, understanding chords, understanding all the harmonics and melodics of sound. At least for me with piano, I'm sure it's different with other instruments and of course the orchestra. But performance is another thing entirely, which is out of the scope of this conversation. It was just an example, so I'll keep going. All right. So I've heard this a lot. Consensus in determining a good or bad quality of a story doesn't result in objectivity. And I would say, yeah, generally speaking, I don't think consensus guarantees anything.
Mhm.
But if individual critics within that consensus use evidence, then at least they have something to argue or some point of reference that we could understand. So that's where we look at, let's say, the critical response on Rotten Tomatoes and the user response, or the audience response. Why is there always such a discrepancy? And we're not talking a small, we're talking like a factor of like sometimes 50 percentile. It's huge.
Mhm.
And the funny thing is, I would rather trust the audience, not because I think they're any good at being objective, but because there's thousands and thousands of them compared to like 12 or 20 or maybe 100 critic responses. So again, you have to go to the individual. You have to say, hey, buddy, what is your critique of My Fair Lady, or the first Star Trek movie? Like what was it that made it good or bad? And figure out those elements that they're giving. Because there is no set in stone formula, as I said before, in determining good or bad stories. Everything's on a case by case basis. And as you go up further on the genre scale to story as a idea, as a series of events where a character has to come to a resolution, we see how that can play out.
Mhm.
And that's why I like evaluating series pieces, because I can look at, especially Star Trek is weird as hell. If you look at
Mhm.
the first movie and the second movie, it's like there's that joke that all the even numbered Star Trek movies are good and all the odd
Yeah.
numbers are bad for whatever. I don't know where that came about, but if you actually watch them, you end up enjoying the even numbers more for, again, I don't know why. It's
I
a
mean, it's eh.
it's a fun thing. It's a
I don't
funny
think
thing to think about.
it is funny to notice that. Like, I don't think that there's truth to it, but that's true. But but like, sorry. To go back on the question, um, I would say that that I agree. Like, consensus is not good in determining whether something is good or bad, and it doesn't result in objectivity. I would just argue that it gives you a general evaluation, and not even an evaluation, and a general estimate on the quality of the movie, or whatever piece of art, rather than its actual, well, quality, either subjectively or objectively. Like, recently, I went to see the Godzilla movie, for example, and all the critics love it, and all the audience, like, they loved it, and I've come to the conclusion that it's that it's not a good movie. But anyways, the point that I'm trying to lead is that I think that generally critics tend to uh, focus on the interrelation of the integration of all the elements, as I argued, regarding excellence. Whereas, in my opinion, I think that the audience just evaluates a degree of entertainment. Were they entertained by something? And I think that entertainment itself is pure subjective. So I don't think, like, just because an audience was entertained by something that they like, that means that it's good. And the same thing applies with critics. Just because they gave it a bad review objectively doesn't mean that the movie's good either. It has to be evaluated on its own standards.
Coming from a Godzilla movie, there's probably a lot of variation on what is considered a good Godzilla movie, because you're talking about the late 70s, I believe, when they started with the
I,
Godzilla films.
I
So,
haven't watched, like, any Godzilla movie. Just, like, I was just judging it on its own basis, and on its own basis, I thought that, like, the movie itself was not good. Like, there was not enough fight scene, not enough fight scenes. The characters themselves were boring. The theme was not meshed properly. It was all over the place. Uh, Everything. I would even go so far as to say that it's a bad movie objectively. But the point is basically that both the audience and critics, in my opinion, are wrong because they focused on different elements. One was just whether or not they were entertained, and the entertainment aspect was not satisfactory, or not enough satisfactory. Like, there's only like 4 different fight scenes, and they're rather short, and they always focus on the characters that you don't care about, and then the story itself is just boring as hell, which all the critics complained about, and the audience just doesn't care. So I think, like, both sides are wrong and they're right at the same time. So, but yet I argue that, and everyone disagrees with me. So, so what's the consensus? I don't know.
okay. Well, this I get a lot. This question a lot is a writer of a certain style of writing. Let's say I don't know, Anne Rice better than Neil Gaiman. You know, they both do fantasy, but one is more like horror or vampire, whereas one is sort of just fantasy in general. And this is where you can try to evaluate, but it's still the same problem we had before of
Yeah.
comparing apples and oranges. You just don't do that and expect a good result. There's not. What are you going to do? Like, okay, well, you can look at characters. Characters are universal. You can always use that as a standard, but you can't really do this. And this is what I refer to as incommensurability. Now, commensurability is the idea of having variations of details in, let's say, a scientific experiment, that people may have different hypotheses, but they have the same results. And
Mm.
the hypotheses can be explained, or the results can explain both hypotheses. And that's where we say, okay, well, if we don't have the right language, if we don't have the right terms, we can't come to any understanding of what exactly it is going on, even though we have all the same data. And that's where we stop. We say, okay, if we can't do that, then there's no reason to continue because there's no new data to get, there's no new evaluation. It's just, again, oh, apples and oranges, they both have sugar, but you're talking about a totally different experience, a totally different thing.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I sort of just skip this question because I don't see the point.
Yeah.
Um, if we're,
There's someone that sent that gave a um, $5 donation. Do you want to answer that or?
oh, okay. Don't you think bickering could be stamped out by reframing the argument? Something being poorly crafted and not just vaguely objectively bad. Well, that has to do with production value or quality of the writing, or the diction they're using, how good are they at writing itself. So that's why people say The Room is objectively bad. It is fundamentally a bad movie. It was poorly put together. The writing was bad, the delivery was bad. I think some of the production value was okay for an independent film. So you giving it a certain standard that you're evaluating it at. But bickering in general, it depends
I
what
mean,
we're bickering about. What's the detail? What is the element? If it's a subjective element, then yeah, we could totally eliminate that. But when people say, "Oh, you're just nitpicking this scene," like sometimes I am, and sometimes what I'm talking about is a detail of a detail. That's true. But once those
mm,
questions start popping up, once I start bickering, there's a good reason why I'm doing that. It's not because, oh, why is Superman's cape now, more red than it was in this scene than the last scene. I'm not doing that. That's, whatever. I don't care about details like that. I care about details of what the character is doing, how they know things, and how their lightsaber can now cut or not cut through a wall, or what light speed travel is, or all these details that we need to have information on. That's necessary to understand a scene, because there are questions at that point in time the narrative has raised and just totally forgot about. And that's not good. There are sometimes stories that need to do that. Like in murder mysteries, you need to raise questions. Like, wait a second, what were you doing there? How did you know that? And usually those are clues to give the audience information as to what's actually going on in the story. That's kind of the point. You want the audience to pick up on these things.
mhm.
And sometimes they're so subtle, so you have to know about the genre, you have to know about the author, how they write these characters, how they write these scenarios, and reveal those clues to the audience. Because if you're not, then every new Raymond Chandler or Rex Stout or any other non-American author on murder mystery, you're going to be reading it and you're like, what the hell am I reading? Like, why are all these pages and pages of information? What's the point of all this? And it's for you to pick up on something. Now, those aren't good examples. I would say Agatha Christie is the best because her stories are a lot tighter, so you have to really pay attention. Whereas, Rex Stout would write a novel, and you're like, okay, there's like 20, 30 chapters. You're like, okay, all this stuff is happening, maybe 40% of that is the actual plot of the murder, and the other 60% is just all these other characters just walking around doing their thing. So that's where the fluff of a story is added to, and that's where I would evaluate a story as being objectively bad, because they're wasting my time on the purpose and function of what a murder mystery is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be War and Peace. It's supposed to be a tight little room where something happened, and I got to figure that out. So when we argue with stuff, yeah, sometimes you have to say, dude, you're arguing about fluff. We were talking about the color of a shirt suddenly changing. Yeah, it could be a minor visual mistake, but ultimately, we can just throw those away. But all the details on questions that the story is raising, or the elements that aren't properly expressed, yeah, those context is really important. So yeah, you would definitely want to argue those, even if they're nitpicky.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry. No, I agree. Like, I just think the only thing I would add to that is just that the difference is that I think that the argument is also asking, the problem is not what's the problem with people bickering? I think that when you say that something is objectively bad, it kind of puts a qualifier that when you say that something is objective, it means that it is to a degree true. Therefore, there is no other interpretation or arguments that can be made. It is merely fact at that point. And I think the problem is that if you declare something to be objectively bad, you make the definitive qualifier on that statement. And I think people don't like that. I think that's the real problem. And I think that, like, if you just call something like poorly crafted, that's just like one element, and people can still bicker about other things.
Right.
I think that's the core problem why people try to, well, at least avoid calling anything objectively bad, because if I say like Mueller, for example, he just outright just said like The Last Jedi is objectively bad, and people didn't like it for it because there are different evaluations or different aspects of the movie that people admire, so they don't like to be just called, no, all your opinions are unimportant because I declared it objectively bad. I think that's generally the reason why people bicker around the term objectively bad.
It is a powerful statement to make, but when you look at, he spent enough time to evaluate that movie to say that, so he has the argument and he has the evidence to back that up. But even
I don't disagree.
Oh yeah, but with the a specific example of the bombers, it's like everything about them is wrong.
Oh yeah, I don't disagree.
Yeah, so
like I don't disagree like his entire evaluation or anything, or that he has the proper evidence for it. I just think that the pronunciation of calling something objectively bad itself is, I think, too powerful for people to just accept, that they're unwilling to just accept it. So I think that's the real problem.
Yeah, the ignorance of people not understanding storytelling or bothering to take the time to read or listen. That is very common. The common response is, oh, that's just your opinion. You just like certain things that I don't, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And I think there's also one problem in which, what degree do we qualify something to be objectively bad instead of just, the thing is that objectively bad means that it's basically the bottom of the barrel in terms of bad. Like, there's nothing redeeming about it. Or is it just there is no degree of excellence being displayed?
I think that's a strange way of putting it. When I say objectively good or bad, I'm saying that there are evidence for this thing to be functional or non-functional and be presented in an appropriate way it was set out to do. So if you're going to make a romance story and you have a good romance story with characters chasing one another and one having a conflict and making the choice to stop chasing, and then then you actually do care about me, and then they come to some resolution, whether I like that presentation is irrelevant. The fact that those elements exist in that story can say it is a well put together story, but it had an execution problem, right, or some other aspect. So it's not like this perfect thing. And that's where we get into what I talked about, commensurability, where you could have things. That's my next point. Let me just get to the next point then. How about Star Wars and Babylon 5? Which is better? So here we have two space operas
Hmm.
Very different. And you can't really evaluate them in terms of their function because they have completely different functions. One is for the movie, one is for the TV, so different media already. But because they're both space operas, we can use that as a metric. So we can stop at that subgenre and say, okay, what are the elements of space operas we can use? So melodrama, focus on higher ideas like philosophy or emotion, space battles, whatever. Like you can compare those things. So you can look at the graphics of Babylon 5 and compare them to Star Wars. You go, oh, geez, these things are horrible. But Babylon 5 has more realistic physics. So what are you looking for in a space opera? Do you want a more believable depiction of science or how the natural space is? Or do you want your X-Wings to bank in space and have all these sound effects and all that other crap? So there are different standards you can apply to appreciate those things. But again, these are all within the lore of their universe. So it's not like I can just start taking elements and smashing them together and say, look, this is better because it looks better. There's more fidelity of the graphics between Star Wars in the '70s. Yeah, all these visual effects. Like, yeah, of course it looks better, but we're not talking about that when we're talking about story evaluation. So the best example I can give you to answer this question is that they're both equally good in their own way.
Yeah.
And they're both objectively good because I don't need to compare these two
Right. Like,
to prove that.
yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like, to go back on your standard, you argued for the functionality, and I would even argue proper integration of all the materials as to whether or not something is objectively good or bad. And like Babylon 5, like, okay, ignoring like the last season, it was good. Like all the elements came together. It about like the functionality of different races and their politics in relation to the general theme of all the races being united. It meshed well together. It had a proper function and it executed it well. And the same thing for Star Wars, which is more like what is it? A space opera? Not a space opera. Space fantasy about like, well, good versus evil. It properly displayed it. So in both sense, both of them are objectively good. So,
Right.
and there's like no reason to compare the two. So I don't like.
Well, people like to say, what do you like better? Just because it's a simple question
Oh
that
yeah. Oh no, but
people
that
ask.
becomes the preference. Like, which do you prefer? It has nothing to like. Here's the thing that people disagree. Just because you can look at it, I don't. Let me rephrase this. You can prefer things, but still judge things. You should judge things on their own standards without comparing them. Like, I think that there is no need to objectively compare anything. You should just judge things by their own standards, and then when you compare things, you should do them with your own preference. Like if I say, "Oh, I prefer Star Wars," even though I still like both of them, you don't need to say that. Oh, yes, Star Wars is objectively better than Babylon 5 because there's no point of reference and there's no need to compare them. So I think that preferences are fine so long as you just don't compare them in an objective context.
Yeah. So this is I just put on the screen there. This is what I usually comment on when people like things or dislike certain things. That something can be good or bad objectively, but that doesn't mean you have to like it in the same fashion or you use that emotional as your emotional reaction. So I can prefer watching Star Trek over Babylon 5, what have you, but I don't have to give an evaluation of my feelings. So it's just,
Mhm.
you say something, well, you know what? I would argue that Babylon 5 has better characters and characterization and better plot lines, but it's not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
That's perfectly fine. You can say that. But so long as you know the elements and you're taking away your opinion of what those elements mean and focus on what's there and what they actually express.
Yeah. And even then, like, there's no real reason to compare like the characters from Babylon 5 with Star Wars.
Yeah, I know. It's because you're talking about science fiction or science fantasy
Yeah.
or
Like
sci-fi. Yeah.
it's like comparing what's the guy with the he, that guy. I can't even remember their name. Shit. Lando? No, not Lando.
Londo is
Never
in
mind.
Babylon 5, yes.
Yes, it's like compare Londo with I don't know, Luke. Can you really say that because he's more fleshed out as a character? He's better than Luke, or he's worse than Luke? It's how can you even compare?
You can do it from a storytelling perspective, but not from, because we're talking about Star Wars, my mind immediately jumps to space opera.
Yeah, exactly. So it's impossible to compare.
But the thing is, when we're talking about space operas, we go up one more genre, and we then say, well, what's the parent genre of space opera? Well, it's science fiction or it's sci-fi. And I would say Babylon 5 is more science fiction and Star Wars is more sci-fi. So already we're sort of branching. We have these two subgenres which are called the same, but they come from different parents.
Right.
So the purpose is already different. So it's hard to say, because if we say sci-fi already, we've already muddied the waters and we don't have to make this comparison at all.
Yeah. Like I would even argue that Star Wars is like just fantasy with a coating of sci-fi, but
Right.
semantics. But
Yeah,
like
I
if you
know.
remove like the future elements of Star Wars and you just put it in like medieval Earth with the magic and all that, it's just fantasy, but with a coating of space.
A coating of space.
I always call Star Wars just like fantasy in space. It's just like it's basically like an Dungeons and Dragons in space,
See,
basically.
to me, that's Babylon 5. I looked at Star Trek as the Wild West, or sort of cops and robbers, or Indians
Yeah.
and cowboys, cowboys and Indians in Wild West is Star Trek, and D&D as Babylon 5. They got rangers, they got priests, they got warriors, they got all these classes.
Like I think the difference between sci-fi and fantasy is more sci-fi is more about the metaphysics and philosophy, whereas sorry, fantasy is more about the metaphysics, magic, and philosophy and the interrelation between the three, and sci-fi or science fiction is more about uh, philosophy in relation to technology and how we react to it.
It's clearly the futuristic reality
Yeah,
of technology for sure. And the thing is, we can use the same tropes in both. It's just how you wrap your brain around it. Whereas in the future, you think tech. In the past or medieval mysticism worlds, you think nature, you think whatever, magic. So it's the same idea, doing something beyond our understanding with different explanations. And that's why you had all those wonderful comics in the 60s and 70s of overpowered superheroes just, blowing up universes and creating them. And, oh, okay. All the new 52 and all the new power creeps and the nerfing they had to do with all the superheroes back in the day. Which is good for writing. You have to put boundaries on your characters so you can wrap your brain around stuff. Okay, next. Who decides what is objectively good?
I mean that one's easy. Every individual can judge. There's no person of authority that goes like, I am the one critic that can judge anything. Anyone can do it, and the only thing that becomes the evaluation of whether or not it's correct or not is if you have no contradictions. Contradictions is basically the key. If you can make your case and you provide proper evidence, and you say that, again, going with the statement we made, that if there is proper functionality and integration of all the materials for its intended purpose, then it is objectively good.
Right.
But
And
if you make bad evidence and you go like, oh yes, Star Wars is good because the good guy wins, that's not an argument for its totality being good.
the hero character Rey is so powerful. That's why I like her.
Yeah,
It's like,
exactly.
oh, okay.
She's a woman, therefore it's good.
Yeah.
No, that's
Yeah.
that's not a
So
good. That's
so
not a good argument.
knowing what is objectively good is obviously different than liking something. So
Yeah.
I think that's where this question sort of stems from, is because people, well, I like this. Why don't you like it? It's like, well, whether I like it or dislike it is not important. It's what is actually there, and because of that, I dislike it. It's not
Yeah.
it's not just I dislike it and therefore I'm different than you and therefore we're arguing. It's like, no, no, no. This is why it's bad. You can still like it even though it's bad. Again, it's not my cup of tea, but you can go on liking it as long as you like. It's up to you. I think that's where that
And
question comes from.
yeah, well, I see it more as, again, it's just demanding who gets to decide. And again, I would say that the actual merit of whether or not gets to decide whether something is objectively good or not is the art itself. Like the art itself determines whether or not it is good or bad. No one makes that determination. Like the Last Jedi being the Last Jedi is what determines it to be bad, not Mauler or anyone else saying this is bad. It is what it is.
Yeah, you
So
hear
it's
that a
basically
lot. I
just
hear that a
reality.
lot in a lot of conversations without people who are objective, or with like one person who's objective. They say, "Listen, this is what it is. I can't explain it any other way. This is how this was made." It's
I
not
mean,
my
you
opinion.
have to go further than that. You can't just say, you can't just end with the conclusion. You have to make your case uh, building up to it. But yeah, it is how it is because of how it was structured. Again, the standard is the interrelation and the integration of all the materials. That's the standard for all art, because I argue that art is basically just that. It's just the interrelation of materials to convey abstract ideas or values. So you judge it because of how art is. And I think that people don't understand what is art, so they don't have a real standard of judging whether something is good or bad because they just don't know what art is.
Those are big topical questions to get into, but we're not going to jump into those. Okay, next question or next statement. What is it? I don't think it's good and I don't like it are the same thing to me. Well, I think we've already gone over this,
Yeah.
and I don't think it's good. And in what context is it objectively good? Are you just don't think it's composed well? Was it presented well? Does it serve a function or purpose that we can understand? And I don't like it are not the same thing. So this is again someone who's not objective
Yeah.
and getting confused or getting angry at someone who disagrees.
Yeah. It's just preferences. And, again, there's nothing wrong with having a preference. It's just you have to judge the degree of excellence. And that's literally all that matters.
Yeah. So best evidence, best argument. That's pretty much it.
Yep.
That's how it is
And
in life. Really.
also not just best arguments, not having any contradictions. This is like primarily the key. If you have no contradictions, you will always win against a person who has I mean, that goes back to best evidence, but whatever. It's still basically the standard of not having any contradictions will always make you win.
Yeah, I'd say
Make you
so.
correct.
Yeah. Okay, so setting up a standard for evaluation is impossible. I've heard this a lot that they always ask me, what's your standard for evaluating this or that? It's like, well, I have generic reasons for evaluating all series or all stories, and they can fall into that category, but they don't have to. And that's kind of the beauty of how this works. Let's just assume there isn't a standard. You know, not everything has to have a standard. Not everything has to be placed in some sort of box or this
I mean,
criteria.
I mean, I disagree. Okay, there's no one standard. I would argue that there's a multitude of standard, but the central premise, sorry, not central purpose, the central foundational standard is, again, we already discussed it. It's I wrote it down. Whether or not it's properly functional and if there's proper integration of all the elements coming and being united as a whole.
Oh,
That
yeah,
I
we
that
agree
I
on that.
argue
Yeah.
is the I argue that everyone works under that standard. Even you, all your videos basically advocate that. They go like, "Oh, why didn't?" Basically, it's arguing like that took me out of the experience. There's similitude, or that didn't make sense. It was contradictory. So it's all about like the integration of all the elements coming together.
Right.
That is the standard. It's
And
just
the
I just think that most people don't recognize that, or they just implicitly know it, but they just don't know that it's the standard.
and the evaluation and argument for a standard, if you want to go that far, is the process called commensurability, which I just talked about previously, where we have the same data, but we have different viewpoints for what that data means. But because we have data, we have the same vocabulary that we can communicate these ideas properly. So we can come to a standard, and then we'll have party B and party C and party D, and we're going to have arguments, we're going to have disagreements, but that standard is going to get even closer and closer to clarity as possible. So it's not like there's like 2% overlap. It's like 80%, 90% overlap. It's very high. And that's what we talk about, the details. So that 10, 20% we argue about is either, again, stuff we didn't observe, stuff we don't understand, or we have a bias towards the other stuff that we do like and we choose not to evaluate or accept that 10 to 20%. So that's usually what's going on. There's a very rare case where there's someone's lying or intentionally leading you on. I'm not aware of that because I don't get into conversations with people like that. But there are possibilities someone's lying when things happen. So that's how I see it. It's just arguments on commensurability that we all agree upon, so long as we have all the facts.
I mean, I think that that's part of the argument, but again, I go with more art is made that specific way. Because again, as I define it, art is the integration of materials within reality to convey abstract ideas and values. And because of that's what art is, and it cannot be literally anything else. The fact that art is art basically is the standard of evaluation, more than just people understanding what is the common grounds to understanding a piece of art. So I think that by understanding what art is, people can recognize that it becomes the standard of evaluation for everything. I think that just people have not recognized what is art, that they don't know what standard to evaluate it.
Yeah, I can see that happening. Okay. So this is what I've heard before is there's different people throughout the world. There's different teachers who teach the same topic. They have different cultures. They have different languages. They have different standards and tastes. And I would say, yeah, they do have different ways of teaching, different ways of appreciating things. And, everyone has their own flavor of music, certain styles of jazz, subgenres of jazz, or what have you. So again, you wouldn't evaluate African jazz to Montreal jazz. You wouldn't do that. You can try, right, but why would you?
No need.
There's really no reason to do so. You would compare it to like artists or like sounds and say, oh, I like this guy's sound. I like this instrument more when he plays it. So you don't use one standard for one genre or one media for another. It's just that simple. So you can use objective observations and conclusions in different ways and being good or bad and evaluating as such. It doesn't imply there's only one way to do it because we don't have all the information. We don't have all the understanding of the thing we're observing. We can't. We're human. It's how life works. We just can't know everything by looking at something. So some person might have better perspective than me. I could have more than they do. I could have more observations than they do. It's how it goes.
And I also disagree that there are different standards. I think that there is only one standard. Again, the functionality and integration of the art. And I think that the difference is that people have different they don't see the unified whole. They mostly see one element. They go like, to go back to the car analogy, they only compare the standard of if whether or not there's a proper wheel, there's a proper, I don't know, letter seat, and they compare those different standards instead of one single standard by which all art is. Because I argue that no matter the culture, art remains the same. It doesn't matter if you go in Africa, in Montreal, or Japan or whatever. All art remains objectively the same. Just the integration of materials to convey values or ideas, and no matter what, that remains the same. So it doesn't matter if Japan or Montreal or whatever has a different standard. It remains the same consistent standard because we're all human and we all create art the exact same process. It's just that we have to not compare those art. We just have to judge it by itself. That, I think, is the problem.
There is arguments about people liking, let's say, French film festivals more than they like North American film festivals.
And I mean, yeah, that's preferences. There's nothing wrong with that. But the argument it being made is that people have different standards by which we can judge, rather than just taste. There's nothing wrong with having different. Again, taste is just a different word for preference. The problem is when there are different standards. How do you judge a French film different from an American film? Like, there's no reason to judge genres. You just judge that movie as itself. There's like no need to qualify or judge the entire genre? Like really, like would you judge the entire science fiction genre more? Why would you do that?
I think when you experience one film, let's say, from one genre, and then you evaluate it based on another. So if I watch the Dune, the original 1979 or whatever it was, Dune, uh, David Lynch film,
Hmm.
and then I compare it to the TV series, the miniseries in the 90s, there's a lot of not discrepancy. There's obviously more detail in the TV series. There's more room, but there's also a lot of scenes that weren't added that they should have kept. So you like the because it all comes from the same source, which is great. So you know where they're getting their ideas, and you can compare it to the books. So I could say, hey, you know what? In certain elements, they kept it in here, or they changed this over there. Why did they do that? Format, time, money, all sorts of reasons. And you could say, I like this better, but to compare the two, even though they're the same story, they're both on the screen, are different because one's a movie, one's a TV show or a miniseries on a TV show, different production values. I would say not really the same story beats, different feeling, but what an achievement to even get Dune on the silver screen in the 70s in that way. The strangeness and weirdness of it that it was. During the late 70s, early 80s, where they had all those weird, I wouldn't say interpretive science fiction films, but just strange as hell to understand what was going on. And the various cuts, the various director cuts that came out were sort of helping and hindering it.
Hmm.
Same with the Blade Runner, same with a bunch of other films then. Very, very interesting to look at. But to compare them probably isn't going to help you understand the story better. It'll help you understand it differently. So there's
Yeah.
no like true interpretation of the book.
Maybe it gives better context.
It's an
Or
adaptation to another medium.
yeah.
So you're always going to lose something.
Hmm.
And you can then you can evaluate the story as a movie within that world. You can do that, but you can't do it from book, because everyone will always say, "Oh, you just read the manga, just read the book, just read the original piece, go watch the original play." Don't listen to the radio drama, don't listen to the comic book. It's like, well, yeah, true. It's not going to be as great as the original piece, but that thing as a movie, that thing as a TV show, can be evaluated by itself.
Yeah. I just think that most people evaluate the two because uh, they have a greater frame of reference.
There's more. There's more in the book, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. If you read the books, it's amazing. Of course, it's
Yeah, of course.
it's a space epic, so it's kind of expected to be on the level of Asimov and what have you. So
Hmm.
obviously, you're not going to get the same experience, but if you have an hour and a half to kill, or was it? I think there were three Children
Yeah,
of
there's three
Dune.
books.
Well, yeah, but
Yeah,
I'm
it won't take you an hour to read all of them. That's for
no, no,
sure.
no. They're big. I was thinking of the miniseries. How I think they made three. So yeah, like if you have the 4 or 5 hours to kill, um, they're. I found them both entertaining. I didn't like them as much as the books, but this is the same with anything else really. From book to movie or book to screen, you lose a lot in the adaptation. So anyway, that was a little rant on science fiction and TV. I think we have one. Was it one more or two more questions? We got two more. All right. All right. This is about this is always the relativity issue. The purpose and function of a thing is relative to the individual, and this was very
What?
similar to the previous question we had on the start.
What does that even mean?
Yeah.
Relative to the
So
individual.
let's say I look at a car, right? And we know the function of a car, the Ferrari, but if I'm using that Ferrari to go buy milk, that's relative to my life, my lifestyle, what I want. What I want out of a car is to go buy milk. Well,
But yeah, but that's still the same. You're still using the car for driving, so the function still remains the same objectively.
right, but we're not using the car in the way it could be used, or it's where it was
Right.
designed to be used.
but you're still using it, so it
Right.
doesn't matter. It's like it's the equivalent of saying, "Oh yeah, you could drive your car for 10 miles an hour or 100 miles an hour, but you're still driving the car. It doesn't matter how great it performs."
Yeah, whereas the person who looks at The Last Jedi and says, "Well, I really like the flying penguins in the Last Jedi, therefore it's a good movie." It's like,
Yeah, that's
well, you're
relevant.
looking at one element, whereas in the comparison or the analogy to the car is like, "Well, I really like leather seats, therefore it's a good car." It's like, no,
Yeah, no.
not really. It doesn't make it a good car. So it's what you're always asking yourself when you look at a piece of media is what is the function of the media as a whole, and then look at the individual elements, the scenes,
Yeah.
the characters, the conflicts they get into, the music, the drama, whatever is the purpose of that story. If it's a romantic comedy, then yes, drama and jokes and whatever humor you can derive is what you evaluate. Yeah, you can look at the other things like, there one scene there were two rose petals, now there's a bouquet of tulips. Like what the hell? Was the guy paying attention to the set design? The props probably not. That hinders the impact, the verisimilitude of the scenario you're in. So it's how you evaluate it, how detailed you go, and how macro level you go.
Yeah,
And
I think both are important. Again, like I think you're more macro and more sorry, you're more micro and I'm more macro. I see more the unifying of the whole thing, and you're more understanding the functionality and individual pieces. And I think that
yeah,
the answer is basically both together. Like you have to look at the totality and the individual pieces.
well, things like say my favorite movie, I'll say The Princess Bride, right? There's a scene where Inigo gets stabbed like 3 times, and you're like, okay, this guy's dead, and then he just stands up and he keeps fighting. Like, wait a second, how did he do that? But then we know it's because he's so passionate, he's so motivated to kill the six-fingered man. Death won't stop him. It's never really mentioned, but that's the kind of guy he is. That's his entire life, whether it's adrenaline, whether he was so drunk he felt no pain, who the hell knows? And there's little details like that I never really paid attention to. And I must have watched that movie a dozen, maybe 2 dozen times in my life, and I still don't pay attention to it because everything about that is just so well put together that the details you sort of just don't pay attention to anymore because the point is so clear, the function is so clear. It's a romantic high adventure story
Yeah.
about revenge and true love and a bunch of crazy things that happen in a fictional country, and it's fun. It's supposed to be entertaining, and it is very entertaining. And I think that's what you mentioned in the first part, that people want an entertaining movie, and that's why they like it or dislike it. They don't care too much about the highfalutin concepts of screenplay and cinematography and
Hmm.
all the other things. They want to be entertained, and that's I think what's happening with movies today. With was it The Dark Phoenix?
That's
Horrible
correct.
reviews, but I'm sure if you want to spend the $20 or whatever it is to go watch a movie, you're going to be entertained. There's going to be all kinds of explosions. You're going to see a lot of attractive actors trying to kill each other, and that's what you paid for. You're going to get it.
I think there's an over evaluation on entertainment. Like, I'm not saying that entertainment is not important, but I think that just entertainment for its own sake is the equivalent of just having dangling keys in front of your eyes or like bright colors. I think that you need more than that, and that's the reason why art specifically exists to has themes, conveys values, conveys ideas. You can't just have bright explosions and like bad characterization, bad story, bad everything. You need more than just entertainment.
That is true. However, if the function or purpose of the story is to be, or the media, or whatever the thing is supposed to be evaluated at, is sensationalism, then you have to evaluate it as such. So
Oh yeah.
Transformers, it can work. It can work
I mean,
because it's designed to be that way, but
but
it can
it's
also work better if it had more elements to it, if it had drama, if it had plot, if it had characterization that was clearly done and done well. It will only add to the experience. So, but it doesn't have to. You see?
yeah.
You
It's so
can't you
bad.
can't evaluate what's not there, right? You can't say, you know what, this steak is not a salmon. It's like, well,
I mean, I mean, that's not to say that, for example, Transformers doesn't have. You can also judge it by what it doesn't have, and well, not what it doesn't have, but what it lacks or doesn't do well. Like the main character's bad. The overall story arc makes no sense. Uh, the movie is not just explosions. There are different elements to it, and those elements are not intertwined. And I think that's the problem with the
yeah.
Transformers
So in
movies.
that
They're just
analogy,
not good.
yeah, the analogy of the steak, we're not talking, well, the steak is not a fish. Well, yeah, but it doesn't have pepper. It doesn't have
Yeah,
any
exactly.
seasoning. It doesn't have a side dish. There's no wine. Like, what are you doing? So, okay, I think that's everything, guys. I think we got all the main. Yes, we did it. Oh my goodness, these are all the questions that
Ooh.
I've been collecting over the months since my previous video, and I was like, what are all these questions people are asking me? And hopefully we've gone through a bit. We probably could say a bit more about the topic, but really, it's a simple technique for understanding what is actually there in a story and whether those elements are connected to produce an experience that makes sense, provides meaning, and of course entertains the audience to some capacity.
Yeah.
It's not complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated, but when you get into the details of people saying this is impossible, you can't say this, you can't be done, you have to then say, okay, well, why not? And what is the problem with understanding things this way? And you probably won't convince people, that's fine. They're not going to be changed regardless of how much criteria and evidence you show. That's, again, they can like and dislike things for whatever reason. But when you want a clear and honest understanding of what is there, you must use objective observation and come to some sort of conclusion, or else we will never be able to understand what's good or bad. The Room is just a movie, and you could like it or dislike it. It could have some elements that you like or dislike it. That makes no difference. Joe Blow can love it for all the same reasons you dislike it.
I mean, I argue that like for the room specifically is well, it is bad. Objectively, it is bad, but that doesn't mean it cannot be entertaining. Like a lot of people like it because of how bad it is. Like I think that even if something is bad, you can still find a degree of entertainment with it,
Oh,
or
there
you
are,
can
there
still
are
have a
many
preference.
reasons why something is entertaining.
Yeah,
There are many reasons why something is comical. But when you're looking for meaning, the the way that we evaluate stories, at least the way I do, is it has two functions. The first one is obviously entertainment, and the second one there is to teach you something.
yeah,
And what it can teach you doesn't have to be some crazy ethic or moral. It could just be, hey, be nice to people
yeah.
because
But
bad things
conveying an
happen.
idea.
Yeah. It could be any other ethic, it could be any other reason. So things like that, a moral or an ethic, which is not alien to storytelling, you should usually have some sort of message with the story, so long as you don't beat it over the head of everyone's face. You don't just start smacking. By the way, did you know that it's bad to hurt people? It's like, oh
I
yeah,
mean, you can. I would even argue that there's nothing wrong with beating over the head about that. It's just whether or not it it makes sense within its own story and it's just properly integrated.
if
Like
it's
imagine if it's like an hour of just the same character repeating how bad it is to murder. Uh, then it's just obnoxious. Not just obnoxious, but there's no integration. It's just there's nothing to it other than that.
yeah, if it's a children's story, then you need to have a very clear message anyway. So that might be great if you're telling a story about a bunch of magical bears running around trying to help their friends out, conquer some evil kingdom from stealing people's hearts or whatever. But when you're talking about mature stories where you want to develop a character and understand their plight and understand what they're going through and why they're doing things, you have to be a little bit more sophisticated. You could still have blatantly obvious themes or messages, but that's not the focus. That's sort of like a bonus. It's like, hey, the hero's going to do something and conquer something and achieve something, and along the way he learned X. It's like, oh, really? Isn't that just a warm, fuzzy, good societal reason to pet a dog tomorrow or whatever, whatever the reason or whatever the moral is. that's a good thing. So it's not essential, but teaching something to the audience is hopefully why we have culture. We have oral traditions, we have written traditions. This is what they were originally designed to do. And hopefully we can keep maintaining lessons, whatever those lessons are, so that your story is not just explosions and sex and titillation. It is there's something more than just the solid matter that we're composed of, the spiritual beings that Yoda was referring to. We're not just this empty shell of people. There's something more there. That's kind of what we're going for. We're looking for the substance of stories, and that's why we like all the classics, all the classic games with stories in them, like Planescape Torment and KOTOR and most of the Russian authors, all these wonderful stories that aren't going away anytime soon. So, yeah. I think I've exhausted your time, sir, for one day.
Oh, I have unlimited time.
Unlimited power. Okay.
Yes. No, it was no worries.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're good. These are eventually we're gonna good foundation for a video for whenever I get around to it. If anyone has any questions, now's a great time. You got us both on the air. We're very opinionated fellows. We got lots of ideas running through our brains. Yep. I don't know what's been going on. I've not been watching the streams, so I do apologize. I know someone gave me a question. I do appreciate the super chat.
And super chat. That's the name. I couldn't remember what that was.
You know what? YouTube might change it. Who knows?
Oh God.
It could happen anytime. Just like, nope, we're not giving any super chats anymore. It's going to be called MoneyGram or Money Message or something. I think we're good. All right, guys. Well, thanks for your time, and we'll see you soon.